This week, BMW announced huge updates for both their RT touring bike and the RS Sports Tourer, and so in this video we'll go through all of the details with the 10 key things that you need to know about them, and along the way find out whether BMW have created the best two Tourers on the market in 2025. But before we get started, a massive thanks to Cardo for supporting the channel and making videos like this one possible. If you want to use some of the connectivity features on these new bikes, then of course you'll need a decent headset. But why not go for something better than decent with one of Cardo's flagship products like the PackTalk Edge or PackTalk Pro? We use both of them here on MOTOBOB on all of our lids, and both get great sound quality courtesy of the JBL design speakers, excellent noise gating on the microphone so you don't get any irritating wind noise, and then their DMC or Dynamic Mesh Communication System, which gives you a super reliable high quality connection for up to 16 riders in a group with a mile between each. On top of that, the Pro gets their latest crash detection feature, which of course will alert an emergency contact if it detects a crash. And so it's a great piece of extra reassurance every time you're out on the bike, and also for your loved ones back home. So do check out the links down in the description below to find out more about either of these products. And you'll also find down there a discount code specifically for our viewers. And once again, a massive thanks to Cardo for their support. Now we'll start with the R1300RT, and the most apparent change to this bike, I would say, is the styling, which has had a pretty serious modernization. It's looking a bit slimmer, perhaps a touch more angular as well, and so I'd say, especially in this blue, white and red paint job, that it does have a more sporty vibe than anything that's been available on the previous Gen 1250. Specifically, I do think as well the front end will kind of dominate this new look, with a few standout features like the revised lighting with those DRLs along the bottom, the radar, which we'll get onto later, and then that massive windscreen wrapped around the whole lot, which I think will be one of the more contentious talking points about this new aesthetic. But really though, this whole update was brought about by the recent introduction of the 1300cc version of their Boxer Twin, which was first seen in the GS, closely followed by the GS Adventure. Then a couple of weeks back we got the new R model, and so this, the RT, and the new RS are the last two to complete the set in moving over from that 1250 to the new 1300. Naturally, more capacity means a bit more performance, and so in all of the bikes it now makes 145 horsepower peak instead of the 136 of the 1250, and 149 Nm of peak torque versus the 143. And I will add that both peak figures are made at pretty much the same point in the rev range as the previous gen engine, and so there's no need to work it harder in order to access this slightly improved performance. I tried it out in both the GS and the GS Adventure, this new engine, and it is a notable improvement. You know, it still retains the same character, which I think is crucial, and it's what a lot of people like about these bikes, but just with a bit more pluck at the top. It feels a touch more happy to rev, and that's probably ideal for a touring bike where you might be loaded up with luggage, potentially carrying a passenger, and yet on the motorway you need that extra oomph to carry out quick overtakes. So probably going to be pretty well received from your average RT owner. Now, another substantial and recent development from BMW is the introduction of their new ASA system, or automated shift assistant. This is an optional extra. The standard bikes will all be manual, but if you do spec it up, basically the clutch and the mechanical shift lever are replaced with electronic actuators, and so the bike's electronics can actually take care of both. That means in practice you can either run it as an automatic, so you can twist and go with no clutch, and then the bike manages all the shifts, or you can put it in a manual mode and there's a dummy foot shifter which does everything electronically. So there's still no clutch, but the shifter goes some way to kind of replicate some of the feeling of riding a manual bike. Now I've tested this out on both the GSs, and I've got to say I was pretty impressed. The clutch is really quite smooth. The automatic shifts are decent if you get it in the right mode, and so definitely go and have a look for that video if you do fancy finding out more. But it's probably going to come as no big surprise that this is also now an option on this RT, and for me, I think it does probably best suit this kind of bike where you might be doing really big days in the saddle, and so a little extra assistance can take a bit of the sting out of the miles. In exactly the same way, Honda's DCT system, for example, appeals to me more in a bike like the Goldwing than it does perhaps in maybe an Africa Twin, where I'd probably still go manual. Anyway, wrapped around this new engine and that optional automatic box, you've got new frame that moves away from the steel trellis of the previous generation in favor of one that's now made from sheet metal, much the same as the two new GS's. The result, they say, is that the frame is much more compact. The same could be said of the engine as well, but also it helps to improve handling with higher levels of stiffness. Then, the tubular steel subframe has also been replaced, this time by lattice aluminium tubes, and this, they say, is one of the measures that also helps to concentrate the bike's mass around the center of gravity, which again they say makes for better handling and a sense of effortlessness. That's all the marketing bump anyway, but I will say there's a pretty big difference between the 1250 GS and the 1300, not just because it's stiffer and the mass is more concentrated, but also because of the smaller engine, the lighter frame, plenty of changes all across the bike that meant that they dropped the weight massively, which is always going to lead to a significantly easier bike to ride, a more nimble feel out on the road, and dare I say it, potentially a bit more of a sporty feel as well. That, unfortunately, wasn't necessarily the case with the GS Adventure. That pretty much maintained its weight, and it's the same here as well. It's actually 2 kilograms heavier than the 1250. So the 1250 came in at 279 kilograms curb. This one is 281. And so perhaps because they've added more features elsewhere, well, that wipes out any improvements on the core parts of the bike. Potentially a bit disappointing if you were hoping for something more light and manageable. Although you could argue it's maybe less of an issue here when you're pretty used to touring bikes being quite heavy versus something like the GS, which is partially intended to be able to go off-road, and so something very light for off-roading is far preferable, and also something that's much easier to pick up. Perhaps, though, there is one slight saving grace with this new chassis, and that's the wheels. 17 inches front and rear, of course, cast aluminium with hollow spokes, but they do come in 1.4 kilograms lighter per set than the previous generation, and so despite the total weight still being the same or 2 kilos more, well, it still might feel a little more light on its feet and engaging to ride. On top of that, there could be some handling improvements from the suspension as well, which gets the latest version of their telelever front end called Telelever Evo, which again was first seen on the 1300 GS. This has a decoupler on the bars from the suspension, so it stops them tilting when the front end compresses, and then also the paralever swing arm at the back. Well, that's also their most recent Evo version, which they say gets a stiffer connection to the frame. Where things start to really get quite interesting though on the suspension front is with the electronics, and while Dynamic ESA, or their semi-active electronic suspension, has been an option on this bike for some time now, well, this new version introduces a new feature for it called DCA, or Dynamic Chassis Adaptation. Essentially, what this does is allows you to switch between two modes, with the first being a little bit lower set, which gives you a flatter angle at the steering head, and they say that's going to give you maximum stability and smoothness. So effectively, this is the one you'd choose for just cruising along steadily. Mode 2, though, well, it raises the rear end, I believe, by 30 mil, and naturally that steepens the head angle, so that's going to give you quite a different geometry, and they say this will give you quicker, more responsive turning, which is better suited, of course, to more spirited riding. Sounds quite interesting to me. I mean, a Tourer is meant to be versatile, it's meant to be comfortable on the motorway, but still engaging on the twisties, and so potentially this is a great solution that does both, and that's on top of the regular semi-active stuff, so the damping and spring rate are still going to adjust to your riding style in real time, and it also gets their load equalization, which is basically automatic preload that keeps the bike level regardless of whether you're riding solo, two up, with luggage, or both. Now, onto the brakes, and it's again a pair of radially mounted 4-pot calipers up front, a big 2-pot caliper at the rear, but the main development for this year is you've got the option to upgrade to a sports brake pack, which is also true of the GS's. They don't give this one a particularly hard sell though in the press release, which is rare for a motorcycle manufacturer, because in their words, they say, in addition to a sportier look with titanium colored brake calipers, it offers a slight increase in braking performance. So look, if BMW are saying it's only slight, well, don't expect them to feel vastly more powerful, and perhaps internalize that this one is mainly for the looks before you check that box on the configurator. This next point though, I'll be very interested to get your take on, because they say they've tweaked the ergonomics to make the RT feel even more dynamic, with the bars being wider set, a little less swept back, and also mounted further forward, which gets you a bit more over the front, they say, and also with a more aggressive arm position that'll be, I guess, with less sweep, a bit more elbows out. They say this results in improved feedback from the front section and therefore even greater controllability during dynamic riding. And while that does sound good in theory, I've got to say what I really liked about the previous gen 1250RT is the fact that it is really quite sat up and super comfortable for doing big miles. I thought that was the whole point of buying one, and if I wanted more of a sports tourer, I'd probably more so be looking at the RS. But anyway, I'll have to reserve judgment until I get to ride one in a couple of months. And the good news is I think the relationship between the seat and pegs has stayed pretty much the same. And also there's a bit of adjustability with the seat, both up and down and also with the angle. So potentially there's enough room for maneuver to find something that's sustainable for plenty of hours in the saddle. Speaking of the seat height, it's a lot lower now. It now comes in at 780mm, so that's 25mm less than the previous gen, although it still can be adjusted up by 20mm. As well as having low and high options in the accessories catalogue, and so with the adjustability and the extra options, there should be something to suit pretty much riders of all sizes. Nice touch is that the passenger has also been considered on this new bike. I think it's one that will be ridden fairly frequently two up. And so while the side cases are still the same in terms of capacity, they've redesigned them to give the passenger more leg room. The pillion seat is a little bit longer as well, that allows them to shuffle around on longer trips and find a more comfortable position. And get this, there's even a heated backrest option now, which I think with some passengers will go down very well indeed. I guess that brings us neatly onto the tech then, which as you can imagine is a substantial list, and I'm kind of struggling to know where to start with it, so I'll just rattle it off in no particular order. Riding modes, you've got Rain, Road and Eco as standard, but if you spec up there Riding Modes Pro Pack, you get Dynamic for a bit more snap, and also Dynamic Pro, which allows you to customize the rider aids and settings a little bit further. I should add, that dynamic chassis feature that kind of messes with the suspension and geometry does tie into the riding modes, which I think is quite cool. So if you put it in dynamic, I assume it's going to jack the back end up, whereas if you're in rain mode and you're looking for something very stable and grippy, one assumes it'll go into mode 1 where it sits down a touch more. Then there's cornering traction control and ABS, there's engine drag torque control, and all this stuff is managed through their 10.25-inch TFT display, which I think is pretty much the same as the previous generation, but that's by no means a bad thing. It's one of my favorite dashes that I've ever used on a bike, and the massive amount of screen space means you can actually split the screens, so you can either have it all just the basic riding information, which is really quite wide, or you can have one half with the basics like the speed and revs and gear position, and that leaves enough space on the other side for connectivity features like media and calls and navigation as well. Now if you like your tunes on the bike, well, I'd recommend using the Cardo that I mentioned at the top, but if you're someone who likes to let everybody know that you like listening to music, then you can fit their audio system or Audio Pro system, and that'll give you speakers integrated into the bodywork. On top of that, you get FM radio and DAB, as well as some different EQ settings so you can really get it to your taste. And you've got a USB-C port in the vented phone charging compartment up in the cockpit. Their emergency SOS button is an option as usual. And then the lighting has also been significantly upgraded for this new model. Now they call the LED headlight state of the art, with 12 low beam LEDs and 5 for the high beam, along with that distinctive new daytime running light that sort of runs along the bottom. Now there is, of course, a way to go one further. There's a Headlight Pro package that you can spec up. And so if you were underwhelmed with having like 17 LEDs as standard, well, this one gives you 16 low beam LEDs and 31 for the high. And it brings in all sorts of lighting madness, like pitch compensation. So when you're accelerating and braking and the bike's pitching a little bit, it will compensate for that by tilting the headlight so the beam stays level. It's adaptive as well in terms of cornering, so it'll illuminate the inside of a turn for better visibility of the road surface through corners at night. And then I think the most advanced of the bunch is the adaptive light modes feature, which they say is kind of speed dependent. So of course, the faster you're riding, the further ahead you need to look, and so it'll change the beam and where it aims and the intensity of the beam to give you better visibility further down the road, whereas when you slow down, it's going to focus that beam more on the road surface and immediate surroundings. Lastly, on the tech, then you've got the radars at both the front and rear, and so that gives you active cruise control, so you can just follow the vehicle in front at a set distance, although this, to be fair, was already an option on the previous Gen 1250. There's front collision warnings as well, and lane change warnings, aka blind spot warnings from the rear radar, and then fairly recently, I think they just rolled this out on the GS Adventure, they've got rear end collision warnings which will flash your rear indicators quickly if it detects a vehicle approaching what the system thinks is a bit too fast. And so they might be likely to run into you. I really like this one. I think that's a great safety feature that more so puts the onus on the driver instead of the biker, because there's very little you can do sometimes to get out the way when you're stopped at a junction. Now, I severely hope you weren't expecting this one to be cheap, because if you were, you're going to be sorely disappointed. In the UK, it starts at about 18.5 grand, and I believe the 1250 started at about 17.5, and so that's already a decent hike of around £1,000. But then with so many options now, including the ASA, the dynamic chassis, the radar stuff, the heated backrest, well, realistically, it's going to be over 20 grand probably for the majority of buyers. I'd love to know what you think of this one in the comments. Is that heated backrest a symbol of everything that's wrong with the motorcycle industry at the moment? Is there too much tech, too much comfort, too much convenience, and ever increasing motorcycle prices at a time when most of us are feeling the squeeze? And whatever happened to bikers being a tough breed? Would Ogre have ever had a heated backrest? Then again, your passenger, they might absolutely love that, and so you might think it's all good. I'd love to know what you think of stuff like that down in the comments. Anyway, on to the RS, which is more of a sports tourer, as you may well have noticed from these pics, with a very clean and svelte and sporty look now, and I'd even go so far as to say it makes for quite a nice looking bike. I think it's a bit of an improvement anyway over the 1250. Partly down to the engine, I think. I thought the Boxer Twin always looks a bit jarring with a sporty bike, but on this one, it's very much blacked out, and also the engine has been slimmed down a bit, and so it's not as noticeable now, and I think it looks a bit more congruous as a sporty bike. Anyway, we've covered a lot of the changes here, and it's pretty much the same in many regards. So that 1300 Boxer makes 145 horsepower peak, 149 newton meters of peak torque, same as all the other 1300s, and they're pretty much all in the same state of tune. The new sheet steel frame, the aluminium subframe, the 3 riding modes of Rain, Road and Eco, then Dynamic and Dynamic Pro if you pay more. ASA is an option now. It gets the 1.4 kilogram lighter wheels. This one doesn't have the telelever, but it does get an updated regular upside down fork. The slightly better sports brakes are an option. The electronic suspension is updated with the dynamic spring rate that was first seen on the 1300 GS, so that's an improvement over the previous gen, which just gets, I think, damping as part of the dynamic suspension setup. It doesn't get the dynamic chassis though, that changes the geometry like the RT. I think that's a feature that's specific to the RT. And then again with this RS, you've got a fancy headlight with an adaptive option to spec up. And there's also the same suite of radar tech if you like that sort of thing. This one doesn't get the 10.25 inch mega dash though, it gets the 6.5 incher from the GS. Although I'll still say it's a very good dash in my opinion, nicely designed, and you do get a lot of the same layouts and connectivity functions, and probably a 10-inch dash would have looked too big on a more slimmed down bike. Now again, no weight improvement here. The whole lot comes in at 245 kilograms, which again is 2 kilograms up on the previous generation. But still, with the extra power, it should be a bit peppier. The lighter wheels will help as well. The radars and the automated shift assistant are potentially interesting tech options if you do like your tech. And this one also gets a significant drop in seat height from 820mm on the previous generation down to 790mm as standard now, so very good for shorter riders. Generally, I'm expecting something that feels very much the same as the previous generation in the fundamentals, but just sharpened up a bit. And the price on this one is a touch more affordable than the RT at just under 13.5 grand if you're happy with the base spec. So yeah, good 5 grand difference, which is not to be sniffed at. As always, I'd love to know what you think of both bikes though, so do let me know down in the comments below. And ahead of being able to review these two new bikes, I think they'll probably be coming in within the next 2 or 3 months. Well, I've made a playlist which features both my 1250 RT review, my 1250 R and RS review, and so do check those out if you missed them and you want to know what the kind of fundamentals of these bikes are like. Do hit subscribe for more of the latest motorcycle news as well right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching this one, and we'll see you in the next video.